They said the Duke of Blackthorne never smiled. They said he had buried 3 business rivals and 1 fiancée, not in the ground, but in ruin so complete it amounted to the same thing. When his carriage rolled through the iron gates of Valecrest at dusk, the horses didn't slow. They stopped only because the coachman hauled the reins with both arms trembling. Inside that carriage, Adrian Blackthorne sat with his hands resting on his knees, watching the estate's torchlight flicker in the window glass. And the expression on his face was not the look of a man arriving at a dinner party. It was the look of a man arriving at a reckoning. What happened that night shattered 4 generations of Valecrest pride in a single sentence. Stay until the end. You need to see exactly why he said what he said. The Valecrest estate smelled of money performing itself. That was the first thing Adrian noticed when the butler swung the main doors open. The particular combination of hothouse lilies, beeswax candles burned too many at once, and something underneath both of those things, something slightly scorched and overworked, like a kitchen staff that had been cooking since before dawn to prepare food that would be eaten in 20 minutes and praised in 5. It was the smell of a household running too hard to maintain an image it could no longer naturally afford. Adrian knew that smell. He had grown up adjacent to it, in the houses of men who borrowed his father's money and set dinner tables that didn't match their account ledgers. He handed his coat and gloves to the waiting footman without looking at him. Lord Cresswell Valecrest was already moving across the entrance hall, arms spread in the particular way of men who had rehearsed their welcomes. He was a large man in his late 50s, gone soft in the middle, but still carrying the remnants of what must have been a commanding physical presence, broad-shouldered, barrel-chested, with a face that had once been handsome and now was merely authoritative. His smile was the practiced thing, eyes working too fast, measuring Adrian's expression the moment he crossed the threshold, recalibrating twice before he got close enough to offer his hand. Duke Blackthorne. His grip was firm. We are honored. Lord Valecrest? Adrian shook the hand once and released it. You have a lovely estate. He did not mean it as a compliment. Valecrest took it as one anyway. The entrance hall was all height and marble, twin staircases sweeping upward to a gallery landing where several members of the household staff stood in orderly formation, faces arranged into expressions of respectful blankness. Portraits lined the upper walls, generations of Valecrests in various poses of self-congratulation. A massive chandelier threw warm light across everything and made the gilt frames gleam. It was a beautiful room. It was also a room that had not been properly maintained in several years. Adrian could see it if he looked past the candlelight. The hairline cracks in the plaster medallions, the slight warping of the second staircase's banister where moisture had gotten into the wood, the way 2 of the marble floor tiles had been replaced at some point recently, close but not identical in shade to the originals. The kind of repairs a house received when money was available for necessities but not for perfection. A household living inside its own mythology. The family is gathered in the drawing room, Valecrest said, already steering Adrian toward the corridor to the left. I thought we might have a glass before dinner. My wife is very eager to welcome you. And Vivian. He paused, and in that pause, Adrian heard everything. The weight a father put into a daughter's name when she was not merely a person, but an investment. Vivian has been looking forward to this evening very much. I'm sure, Adrian said. The drawing room was warm, over-candled like the entrance hall, and it held 3 women in various arrangements of expectation. Lady Serena Valecrest stood near the fireplace, dressed in pale silver that had probably cost more than the household could comfortably spare this season. A woman of 50 who had once been the standard by which beauty in this county was measured, and who still carried that knowledge in the precise way she held her neck. She crossed the room toward Adrian with both hands extended, which was too intimate for an introduction, but was the kind of thing that happened in households where the social stakes had been elevated to a near religious fervor. Duke Blackthorne, what an absolute pleasure. Lady Valecrest. He took her hands briefly, released them. And then there was Vivian. She was standing near the window, positioned with the exact precision of someone who understood light. The candlelight caught her hair, which was the particular shade of gold that portrait artists spent entire careers trying to reproduce, and her gown was deep blue silk that made her eyes look violet at distance. She was 22 and she knew exactly what she was, and she had known it so long and so thoroughly that the knowledge had become structural. It held her up, organized her movements, determined the angle of her chin and the tempo of her smile. She was beautiful the way things are beautiful when they have been cultivated for that specific purpose. She turned from the window slowly, gave Adrian the full weight of it. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice was pitched low enough to be intimate and loud enough to be performance. Adrian looked at her for 3 seconds, which was long enough to be courteous, and then he looked away. Something flickered across Vivian's face. So fast a man paying less attention would have missed it entirely. Not hurt. Not yet. More the brief electric confusion of a woman who had never, in 22 years of calculated social precision, experienced the particular sensation of being looked at, and then unmemorably set aside. The third woman in the room Adrian had noticed before he noticed any of them. She was standing near the sideboard along the far wall, half behind a tall ornamental screen, in the process of arranging a tray of crystal glasses with the focused attention of someone who was trying to be invisible through sheer quality of work. A maid, by her dress. Plain gray wool, white collar, hair pinned back with the severity that domestic service required. She was maybe 20 or 21, slight, and she moved with the particular economy of someone who had learned to minimize herself in spaces that did not belong to her. What caught him was her hands. She wore long sleeves, which was usual enough. But when she lifted the decanter, the sleeve pushed back slightly, and he saw the edge of something. A bruise, old and yellowing at the margins, the kind of mark that had faded from its original dark to something softer and more acceptable. She adjusted the sleeve immediately, without looking up, with the automatic reflex of someone who had practiced that adjustment so many times it no longer required conscious thought. She hadn't looked at him once since he entered the room. Everyone else in this house had looked at him the moment he crossed the threshold, faces arranged in the complex choreography of social ambition. Even the footman at the door had angled his head slightly, performing deference while also registering the quality of Adrian's coat. This woman had looked at the glasses and at the decanter and at the specific distance between one crystal rim and the next, and she had given him nothing. Adrian accepted a glass of wine from Lord Valecrest and settled into conversation about the eastern road conditions while the room rearranged itself around him. Lady Valecrest directing a young woman he hadn't been introduced to yet, a cousin apparently, to sit on the settee. Vivian drifting closer by increments, close enough that her perfume registered. The maid at the sideboard finished her arrangement and moved toward the door. "Your name," Adrian said. The room went quiet. The maid stopped. She turned, and for the first time he saw her face fully, not half-shadowed behind the screen. She had dark eyes, wide-set, with the kind of steadiness in them that was not the steadiness of confidence, but the steadiness of someone who had learned to keep still under pressure the way an animal learns to keep still when predators are present. There was a cut on her lower lip, mostly healed, and the line of her jaw. Something about it was familiar in a way he couldn't immediately locate. "Eliza, Your Grace," she said. Her voice was quiet and completely level. "How long have you been in service here, Eliza?" He heard Valecrest shift his weight behind him. 7 years, Your Grace." "And before that?" A pause. Fractional. The kind of pause that would be imperceptible to someone who wasn't listening for it. "I grew up in this county, Your Grace." "I see." He held her gaze for one more beat and then turned back to Lord Valecrest with a smooth transition about the wine's vintage, and the room began breathing again. But he had seen the way Valecrest's face had tightened during those 12 seconds. The way Lady Valecrest had moved slightly, instinctively, to position herself in Adrian's sightline. A physical redirection, the way you move when you want someone's attention pulled back to you. The way Vivian had gone very still, not with confusion this time, but with something that looked, just briefly, like genuine alarm. The way Eliza had held herself under his questions with the particular stillness of someone who had learned that the wrong answer, in this house, cost something real. Dinner was its own theater. The dining room held 24 candles in silver candelabra, a table set for 8, Lord and Lady Valecrest, Vivienne, the cousin whose name turned out to be Margaret, 2 neighboring landowners with their wives who had been included presumably to perform as audience, and Adrian. The food was excellent. The wine was better than the household could sustain as a regular habit. Every choice on the table was the choice of people trying to demonstrate that they belonged to a category slightly above where they actually lived. Vivian sat 2 places to his left, and she was extraordinary at it. The dinner, the performance of herself. She knew how to hold a fork, how to time her laugh, how to make her attention feel like a privilege when she directed it at someone. She spoke about a recent opera with genuine intelligence, pivoted to landscape management with the specific knowledge of a woman who had been taught which subjects made her seem more serious without actually burdening the conversation. She was trained for this the way a horse is trained for a particular event. Every movement calibrated, every instinct shaped toward one outcome. Adrian responded when she addressed him, was pleasant, was not particularly interested. The landowner to his right, a red-faced man named Holt, was talking about his cattle. Adrian engaged with this with more genuine energy than he had brought to Vivian's opera observations, because Holt's cattle problems were real and unperformed, and Adrian had long since developed a preference for people who were talking about something they actually cared about over people who were talking about what they believed they were supposed to care about. Eliza moved around the perimeter of the room. She and 2 other maids handled the courses, removing plates, refilling glasses, carrying things in and out of the kitchen passage with the silent efficiency that domestic service required. The other 2 maids were older, thicker, and they moved with the blunt efficiency of women who had been doing this for decades. Eliza moved differently, more carefully. She kept to the edges, stayed behind the sightlines of the guests when possible, and she had a way of becoming briefly invisible between tasks. Not absent, but simply not registered, which was not the same thing. He watched her without appearing to watch her, which was a skill he had developed over years in rooms where displaying the full direction of your attention was a form of vulnerability. She refilled Lord Valecrest's glass first, which told him the household hierarchy was enforced even in the private movements of service. Then Lady Valecrest. Then by protocol she should have moved to Adrian, but she went to Holt's wife instead, and Adrian caught the infinitesimal hesitation before she made that choice. Not carelessness, not a mistaken protocol, but a deliberate slight redirection, the kind you made when approaching someone felt like a risk. He held out his glass when she finally reached him. She filled it without looking at his face. Clean pour, not a drop on the tablecloth. She moved to withdraw, and he said, quietly enough that only she could hear it, "Eliza." She stopped. "Look at me." A long beat, the kind of beat that contained something heavy. Then she looked up, and he saw it again. That wide, watchful steadiness that was not remotely the blankness of a maid doing her job, but was instead the expression of someone who had learned to render their actual reactions inaccessible. "Your sleeve," he said. Her jaw tightened, fractional. "Your Grace." Who did it? It was not a question in the way questions usually are. It came out flat and final, like a statement that had simply not yet received its confirmation. "I knocked into a doorframe," she said. "Last week." The lie was practiced. That was the most important thing about it. Not that she had said it badly, but that she had said it too smoothly, with the fluency of something retrieved from a repertoire rather than constructed in the moment. "Of course," Adrian said, and let her go. He picked up his wine glass. Across the table, Vivian was saying something to Margaret about a recent portrait that had been commissioned of her, and Margaret was performing the appropriate admiration. Lord Valecrest was cutting his meat with the focused attention of a man who was trying to look as though he had not been listening to every syllable of the exchange that had just occurred 6 feet away from him. Lady Valecrest, Adrian noticed, was not looking at Eliza at all. She was looking at him. The drawing room again after dinner, the room rearranged now for the specific purpose of staging the evening's real business. Lord Valecrest with his port, positioned near the fireplace. Lady Valecrest on the chaise with the 2 landowners' wives, performing the social labor of a hostess, making everyone feel simultaneously honored and comfortable. Holt and his counterpart with their own ports, talking cattle again. Margaret had vanished somewhere. Vivian positioned herself at the piano. She played well. Better than well. With the genuine technical facility of someone who had been taught since childhood and had also, at some point, developed an actual relationship with the music beyond its function as demonstration. The piece she chose was complex, and she navigated it without visible effort, and the candlelight was doing everything it could for her hair and profile, and she was in every way exactly what a man in Adrian's position was supposed to want when he arrived at a dinner in a house with a daughter of marriageable age. Adrian stood near the window, port glass in hand, and watched the room. And then he said to Lord Valecrest, who had drifted to his side with the unhurried deliberateness of a man executing a strategy, "There's something I'd like to discuss before I leave this evening." Valecrest's face moved toward satisfaction. "Of course, Your Grace. My drawing room is yours. I want to discuss Eliza Rowan." The port glass in Valecrest's hand went very still. "I beg your pardon?" "The maid," Adrian said, "who has served in your household for 7 years, who told me this evening that she grew up in this county, and whose face—" He paused, let it land, "is of some considerable interest to me." At the piano, Vivian was still playing, but her tempo had changed. A person paying attention could hear it. Not wrong, not a mistake, but infinitesimally slower, as if her processing capacity was being divided. "Eliza is our—" Valecrest began. "She is your domestic," Adrian said. "I'm aware of how she's been classified." Something moved through Valecrest's face, a tidal shift beneath the surface, old and heavy, the movement of something that had been held in one position through considerable effort for a long time. "She is a valued member of our household," Valecrest said carefully. "A hard-working and loyal girl. I'm not entirely certain I understand—" "You don't need to understand," Adrian said. "I'm informing you, not consulting you." He turned to face Valecrest directly. "I intend to speak with her privately before I leave tonight. You'll arrange it." The music from the piano stopped. The room had gone the particular quality of quiet that happens when everyone present realizes simultaneously that something is occurring that they don't fully understand, and that the understanding, when it arrives, is not going to be comfortable. Vivian's hands were still on the keys. She was looking at her father. Lady Valecrest was looking at Adrian. Holt and his counterpart had stopped talking about cattle. "Duke Blackthorne," Valecrest said, and his voice had found a new register, still controlled, but underneath it something that was almost fear and almost fury, and hadn't yet decided which one to become. "I assure you, if there has been some incident regarding the household staff—" "There has been no incident," Adrian said. "This is a separate matter. Please have her available in the East Corridor in 20 minutes. He set his port glass on the sideboard and excused himself to find the facilities, and behind him the drawing room remained in its struck silence. And he didn't look back to see the expression on Vivian Valecrest's face, but he heard, just as he reached the doorway, the particular sound of a piano bench being pushed back hard enough to scrape against the floor. What? He found Eliza himself before Valecrest could arrange anything. She was in the kitchen passage with the older maid stacking the last of the cleared plates onto a cart. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway, and he watched the sequence of reactions move through her face in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, the beginning of a curtsy, and then something else, something careful and wary that settled over the others like a lid. "Your Grace," she said. "Walk with me," he said. The older maid made a sound, not quite objection, but the proximate shape of one. "It's fine, Mrs. Havel," Eliza said quietly, without looking at her. And then she came with him, hands folded in front of her, and they walked through the service corridor to the east passage and stood in the relative quiet where the candlelight was dimmer and the sounds of the drawing room were a distant murmur. He turned to face her. She was looking at the floor. "You can look at me," he said. "I know, Your Grace." She looked up. "I'm sorry. Habit." "What does that habit cost you, usually?" A brief thing moved across her face. Not quite a smile. Not quite its opposite. "It's not a calculation I do anymore," she said. "It just happens." "How long has it been since you were permitted to speak your actual opinion on something?" She looked at him for a long moment. In the dimmer light, the bruise on her wrist was visible again, the yellowed margin of it catching candlelight. "I don't know that I have opinions, Your Grace, in the sense you mean." "You have them," he said. "You had one about me the moment I walked through that door tonight. I'd like to know what it was." Another long beat. She was measuring something. Not him, he thought. She was measuring the cost of honesty, running the calculation she had just said she no longer did. because some calculations are so deeply habituated that they occur below the level of conscious decision. I thought, she began, and then stopped. Say it. I thought you were looking for something, she said. Not, Vivian, not this. She stopped again. Harder this time. Go on. I thought you were angry, she said, but not the kind of angry that shows, the kind that sits. She met his eyes. I thought you were the kind of man who had already decided something before he arrived, and that the dinner was not the reason you came. The passage was very quiet. You're right, Adrian said. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and withdrew a small object. A miniature portrait, the kind that was fashionable 30 years ago, oval framed in tarnished silver. He held it out. Eliza looked at it. Then she looked at him. Then she looked at it again, and her face went through something he could not entirely read, a dissolving, a coming apart of the careful arrangement of her expression, something underneath suddenly visible and enormous and raw. The portrait was of a woman in her mid-30s, dark hair, wide-set eyes, a jaw that was, unmistakably, the same jaw currently facing him in this corridor. Where? Eliza's voice had changed. Something in it had broken loose, and she was holding it by effort alone. Where did you get that? Her name was Anna, Adrian said. She came to my father's estate in the winter of 1843, when I was 11 years old. My father was in a bad situation, a debt situation that had reached the point of genuine crisis. He paused. She worked for 3 months, unpaid, organizing his accounts and managing a negotiation with the creditor that saved not only the estate but probably my father's life. She refused payment. She said she was doing it because his steward had once helped her when she needed it, and the debt ran that way. He looked at the portrait. She left before my father could find a proper way to thank her. He spent years trying to locate her. By the time we found where she'd gone, she had been dead for 2 years. The silence in the corridor was total. Eliza was looking at the portrait with an expression that was not grief exactly, because grief has a quality of surprise to it, and what was on her face was something older than surprise, something that had been living alongside her for a long time in the specific shape of absence. She was my mother, she said. It was not really a statement. It was the sound of something already known being finally allowed to be said out loud. I know, Adrian said. Then you know. She stopped. Her eyes moved to the door of the passage, back to him. The wariness returned, layered over the dissolving thing underneath. Because you didn't last 7 years in a household that had done to you what this household had done without the wariness becoming structural. I know she had a daughter, Adrian said. I know the daughter was 3 years old when Anna left for employment, and that she came back to a situation that had, he paused, changed. She died when I was 8, Eliza said. I know. And after that, I know, he said, quieter. I've spent a long time finding out. She looked at him for a long time. The portrait was still in his outstretched hand, and she hadn't taken it. And he understood that taking it meant accepting the full weight of what it meant to take it, and that weight was significant. What do you want? She asked. Her voice was careful and direct, in a way that told him she was used to transactions, that everything in her experience had been a transaction, and the only safety was in understanding the terms before agreeing to them. I want to settle a debt, he said. A real one, not a sentimental one. Your mother saved something that mattered. The return on that has been owed for 20 years, and it was owed to you, not to anyone in that drawing room. He paused. I'd also like to know what's been happening to you in this house, specifically. She breathed in slowly. That's not, she began. Eliza. His voice was even, not soft, not hard, just direct in the way of a man who was not accustomed to having his questions not answered. I'm going to know. The only thing you're deciding right now is whether I find out from you or I find out from other means. And I would prefer to find out from you, because you are the one it happened to, and your account of it matters to me. Something shifted in her face. Not trust, it was too early for that, and she was too careful for it, but something adjacent to trust, the first molecular motion toward it. They took everything after she died. Eliza said. My mother had a small inheritance, property, left in her name, which meant legally, she stopped. Legally, it should have passed to me. It didn't. Lord Valecrest was the executor. He said there was nothing, that the debts consumed it. She looked at her hands. I was 8. I didn't understand then. By the time I understood, I was in this house working the debt they said she'd accumulated before she died, and I was... She stopped again. Say it. I was not in a position to ask questions, she said, about anything. The sound from the drawing room had changed. Someone was in the corridor on the other side of the house now, footsteps moving with purpose, and he had perhaps 4 minutes before Valecrest arrived to interrupt this conversation under whatever pretext he had constructed. I'm going to make you an offer, Adrian said. Not as charity, not as pity. I am going to tell you exactly what I want to do and exactly why, and you are going to decide whether you want it or not, and whatever you decide I will respect absolutely. Eliza looked at him. I want you to leave this estate with me tonight, he said. Come to Blackthorne. As a guest, not as a servant. My legal team will begin the investigation into your mother's estate immediately, which I believe will establish that significant assets were misappropriated by this household. That process will take time, but the outcome... He paused. I have significant reason to believe the outcome will be clear. She said nothing. There is also the matter of your status, he said. I am aware that Anna Rowan was not a servant's daughter. I am aware of her family's history and of what her bloodline means. That also has implications that will need to be addressed through proper channels. The footsteps in the outer corridor were closer. Why tonight? She said, not suspicious, genuinely asking. Why not tomorrow? Or a letter? Or... Because if I leave this estate tonight without you, Valecrest will have time to move things, Adrian said. And because... He paused. He looked at her wrist. At the yellow-margined bruise that was the most recent of what he suspected was a long inventory of such marks. Because I don't want to leave you here another night. She went very still. The footsteps reached the corridor entrance. Valecrest's voice, too loud, too controlled. Ah, Your Grace, I hope I'm not interrupting. Adrian turned. Valecrest was standing in the doorway in his evening coat, and behind him, just visible, was Lady Valecrest, and beside her, pale as the plasterwork above her head, was Vivienne, and her eyes were on Eliza with an expression that was no longer the brief confusion of a woman briefly overlooked. It was something colder than that, and older, and structured in the particular way of someone who had always known this moment was a possibility and had spent 20 years trying to make it impossible. You're not interrupting, Adrian said pleasantly. He reached back briefly and touched Eliza's arm. The gentlest possible contact, the kind that was both reassurance and question simultaneously, and she said nothing, and she didn't move away, and that was enough. I was about to make an announcement, he said, turning to face the assembled Valecrests in the dim corridor. His voice was completely even, the voice of a man who had decided something before he arrived, and was now simply telling the world what it was. Eliza will be accompanying me when I leave tonight, he said, as my formal guest, under my protection, pending the outcome of several legal matters I intend to open first thing tomorrow morning. The corridor went absolutely silent. Then Adrian said the 7 words that would unravel everything the Valecrest family had spent 2 decades constructing, the words that Vivienne would hear replayed in her head for the rest of that season. The words that Lord Valecrest would later insist he must have misunderstood, the words that the 2 landowners' wives would repeat to every drawing room in the county within 4 days. I also intend to formally request her hand. The sound that came from somewhere in the corridor was not Eliza. It was Vivienne, a single sharp exhale, almost inaudible, the exact sound a person makes when they have been moving toward a destination their entire life and arrive to find the door already locked from the inside. But Adrian was not looking at Vivienne. He was watching Valecrest's face, and what was moving through it, beneath the shock, beneath the fury that was assembling itself into its presentable form, was something else entirely. It was fear. Not the fear of a man who had been embarrassed, the fear of a man who had been found. He knows, the expression said, in the language men use when they believe no one is reading them. He knows what we did. And he has come here not to court a daughter, but to collect a debt. And God help us, the ledger he's carrying is not the one we prepared for. And standing behind Adrian, so still she was barely breathing, Eliza heard the silence the way you hear silence when it contains everything that has been unsaid for 20 years. And she looked at the back of the Duke's shoulders and thought, not yet belief, not yet safety, but the first terrifying edge of something, that she had perhaps spent her life being held under a thing that was, against all probability, about to be lifted. The corridor held its breath. Valecrest's face was doing the thing faces do when the mind behind them has gone to emergency, cycling through responses too fast, discarding each one before it fully formed, landing nowhere. His mouth opened, closed. The port glass in his hand tilted slightly, and a dark drop ran down the outside of the crystal and absorbed into his cuff. Lady Valecrest said very quietly, "Cresswell?" Just the name. The way a woman says a man's name when she is reminding him that they are being watched, and that how he handles the next 30 seconds will determine what story gets told about this household in every drawing room from here to the capital. Valecrest steadied himself. The transformation was almost impressive, so the fear moving back under the surface, the authoritative set of his shoulders returning, the practiced warmth of a man who had spent decades managing other people's perceptions of him reassembling over the top of the thing underneath. "Your Grace," he said, "I'm certain I've misunderstood. Eliza is—" "You haven't misunderstood," Adrian said. "She is a maid in my household. She is a woman whose legal situation I intend to examine in considerable detail beginning tomorrow morning," Adrian said. "Tonight she leaves with me. Those two things are connected, but they are not the same thing, and I'd ask you not to conflate them for your own convenience." Vivian made a sound. Not words. The sound itself was enough. It had the specific texture of something that had been compressed for a long time under a surface of perfect control and had now found the single insufficient crack to push through. She was standing at the edge of the candlelight with one hand on the corridor wall, and she was looking at Eliza. And the look was not the look of a woman scorned in the social sense. It was older and more personal than that. It had the quality of something that had been held privately, in secret, for years. A knowledge about Eliza that Vivian had always possessed and had organized her behavior around. Eliza felt it land on her like physical pressure. She had felt that look before, in 100 smaller versions, across 100 dinner tables and service corridors. But she had never felt it with a witness present, and the witness changed something. The look lost part of its power when someone else could see it happening. "Father," Vivian said. "Vivian, tell him." Her voice had gone flat. "Tell him what she is." The corridor went still in a different way than before. Before it had been the stillness of shock. This was the stillness of something that had been underground for a long time and was now applying upward pressure to the soil above it. Valecrest said very carefully, "This is not the time. Tell him she's nobody," Vivian said. "Tell him she's a charity case. Tell him—" "Vivian." Lady Valecrest's voice cut through clean and cold. Vivian stopped. Her jaw tightened, the hand on the corridor wall pressed flat, and Adrian could see the knuckles whiten from where he stood. He looked at her for a moment, the full, considering weight of his attention, which was not a comfortable thing to receive. Then he said, "Miss Valecrest, I'd encourage you to think carefully about the next thing you say." It was not a threat in the way threats are usually constructed. There was no elevation in his voice, no particular sharpness. It was the tone of a man stating a fact about the immediate future in the same register he might use to observe that the weather was turning. Vivian looked at him. For the first time that evening, the calculation in her eyes was not about appeal. It was assessment, cold and rapid, the kind that happened when the social arithmetic stopped working and something more fundamental kicked in. She was reading him, and what she was reading was arriving as information she had not anticipated. She said nothing. "I'd like to collect whatever Eliza needs from her room," Adrian said, turning back to Valecrest. "She'll want a coat, at minimum. The night is cold. One of your staff can accompany her." "Your Grace." Valecrest's voice had found its dangerous register. Quiet, certain, the voice of a man who had been cornered before and had learned that the only way out was through. "I must ask you to reconsider. What you're proposing, removing a member of my household staff on the basis of A sentimental obligation, an old debt you feel you owe to a woman who has been dead for over a decade. It is irregular. It will raise questions. People will talk, Adrian said. Yes, I've considered that. The implications for your reputation, Lord Valecrest. Adrian's voice had not changed. It never changed. That was the thing about it. It held the same precise temperature regardless of what it was delivering, and there was something in that consistency that was more unsettling than volume could ever be. I have not come here to negotiate. I came here to inform you. Those are different conversations, and you've been attempting to conduct the second one when I've already told you we're only having the first. Valecrest stared at him. Behind Adrian, Eliza stood very still. She was doing the arithmetic she had been doing since the moment he said the words in the corridor, running it fast, discarding variables, trying to find the version of this that made sense. Men did not arrive at estates and upend them for dead women's daughters. That was not how the world she lived in operated. The world she lived in operated by rules she had learned the hard way, and those rules said that people with power used it for their own purposes. And the purposes of Cresswell Valecrest and the purposes of Adrian Blackthorne were probably, at the bottom of it, more similar than different, and she was probably the terrain over which they were being negotiated rather than a participant in the negotiation. She knew this was the rational position. She took it anyway, held it against what was happening in front of her, and found that the rational position and what her body was telling her were producing different outputs. Her body was telling her to go with him. Not because she trusted him. She didn't trust anyone in this house or any house adjacent to it. But 7 years of reading rooms and reading silences and reading the particular quality of a person's stillness had built in her a finely calibrated instrument for detecting when a situation was what it presented itself as. And Adrian Blackthorne was, in every observable particular, exactly what he was presenting himself as. A man who had decided something and arrived to execute it, and whose anger, which was real and structural and old, was pointed at this household and not at her. She would examine whether that was enough reason to trust him later. Right now it was enough reason to move. I don't have much, she said. Every head in the corridor turned toward her. She had spoken quietly, and the quiet of it had an unexpected quality in the charged air. Not small, not deferential, but simply factual, the way a person speaks when they have stopped performing submission and started making decisions. My coat is in the servants' entrance, she said. I don't need anyone to accompany me. Adrian looked at her. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise, exactly. Recognition. 10 minutes, he said. She went. She gave herself 40 seconds in the cold of the servants' stairwell before she let herself feel any of it. 40 seconds was all she could afford. She had learned the economy of this years ago, the way you could allow yourself the shape of an emotion if you put a strict limit on its duration, the way you could be devastated or terrified or something adjacent to hope for a precise interval and then fold it back down and continue functioning. The 40 seconds went. The portrait in his hand. Her mother's face. The jaw, the wide-set eyes, the specific way the candlelight had hit the silver frame. The 20 years between Anna Rowan leaving a coin-thin inheritance to a 3-year-old daughter, and that daughter standing in a service corridor being told by a duke that the debt had been owed all this time. Then she folded it down. She moved through the lower hall to the servants' entrance, took her coat from the hook, heavy gray wool, 2 winters old, one button replaced with a slightly different shade of black, and stood for a moment with her hands at her sides. Mrs. Havel was in the kitchen doorway. The old woman had been in this house for 30 years, and she looked at Eliza now with an expression that was not warm, but was not hostile either. It was the expression of a woman who had watched a situation build for a long time and had never had the standing to intervene and had accommodated herself to that limitation in the way humans accommodate themselves to the permanent features of their landscape. Don't do anything foolish, Mrs. Havel said. I'm not, Eliza said. Men like that don't. Mrs. Havel stopped, started again. Just be careful what you're walking toward. I know what I'm walking away from, Eliza said. That's enough for tonight. She buttoned her coat and went back up the stairs. The entrance hall had reorganized itself around the crisis. Lord Valecrest was near the main door with his hands behind his back. which was the posture he adopted when he was exercising maximum control over the impulse to do something he couldn't take back. Lady Valecrest was speaking quietly with Adrian near the foot of the staircase, not warmly, not with the performed welcome of earlier, but with the specific focused attention of a woman who had assessed the situation and decided that the most dangerous thing she could do right now was be stupid about it. She was, Adrian had noted, significantly more intelligent than her husband. She had understood within 3 minutes of his announcement that the Valecrest position here was not one that could be fought with the tools they had available, and she was now doing what intelligent people did in untenable positions, managing the exit. Vivian was not in the entrance hall. He noted the absence the way he noted all absences, as information, categorized and filed. She was either upstairs or she was somewhere in the house constructing something, and both options were of interest, but neither required immediate attention. Eliza appeared at the top of the service stairs in her gray coat. She descended with no ceremony, which was notable. 7 years of service should have produced in her the instinct to make herself small in a room like this, to hug the wall, to find the least conspicuous path. Instead, she came down the center of the staircase and crossed the entrance hall floor toward Adrian with a directness that was not performance, but was not nothing either. It was the walk of a woman who had made a decision and was executing it before her own nerve could run interference. Lady Valecrest watched her come. The expression on her face was the most honest thing Adrian had seen from her all evening, too rapid to be controlled, gone before Eliza had crossed the room. It was not guilt, exactly. It was the expression of a woman who had made a series of choices over 2 decades and had long since stopped examining those choices and was now being suddenly required to see them from the outside. Eliza stopped beside Adrian. She didn't look at Lady Valecrest. She looked at the door. "Ready," she said. Adrian turned to Valecrest. "My legal team will be in contact within 3 days. I'd recommend you retain your own counsel in the interim. There are several matters that will need to be addressed, and it will go better for everyone if you've had time to prepare." Valecrest's jaw was set. His eyes had the hard, flat quality of a man who had taken a blow and was holding himself upright through sheer architecture of will. "And if I dispute your characterization of those matters?" "Then you'll dispute them through the appropriate channels," Adrian said, "which is how it should be. I have no objection to due process, Lord Valecrest. I rely on it." He held Valecrest's gaze for 1 beat longer than necessary. Not aggressive, not gloating, simply present, simply making sure that the full weight of what had just occurred had been received and registered. Then he turned toward the door. The footman opened it. Cold night air came in, and the sound of the horses and the carriage waiting in the drive, and Adrian walked through and Eliza walked behind him, and the door swung closed at their backs, and the Valecrest entrance hall was left with its chandelier and its portraits, and its 3 people who had not yet begun to speak to each other about what had just happened, and probably would not manage to for some hours yet. The carriage was warm. Someone had thought to place a heated brick at the floor, wrapped in cloth, and there were 2 lap blankets on the forward seat. These details told Eliza something, that the evening had been planned with more specificity than an improvised confrontation, that someone had anticipated the possibility of a second passenger and had prepared for her comfort before it was confirmed. She sat across from Adrian, tucked her hands in her lap, watched the lights of the Valecrest estate diminish through the rear window, and then turned back and looked at him. "Tell me the rest of it," she said. "Whatever you didn't say in the corridor." He looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket again. Not the portrait this time, but a folded document, several pages, which he held out to her. She took it, unfolded it. The carriage lamp threw enough light to read by, and she read, and the further she got into the document, the more her breathing changed. Not dramatically, not the way people breathed in the stories she'd been told as a child, where revelation came as cataclysm. Quietly. A series of small, precise adjustments, the respiratory equivalent of a person recalibrating their understanding of the ground they're standing on. The document was a legal summary. Names, dates, property records. An estate, her mother's family estate, held in trust, which had been assessed at the time of Anna Rowan's death, and which the legal record showed had been transferred to Valecrest administration on the basis of a debt instrument that, according to the note in Adrian's own handwriting in the margin, bore significant questions regarding its authenticity, and at the bottom of the document underlined a figure. She looked at the figure for a long time. "Is this real?" she said. "Yes. This is the value of what they... The estimated current value, accounting for 20 years of estate mismanagement," Adrian said. "The original value at the time of transfer was somewhat lower. Your mother's family had significant land holdings in the eastern county. Several of them have been sold since." She refolded the document, held it in both hands. Outside the carriage window, the dark countryside moved past, the shapes of trees against a sky that was just beginning to suggest the possibility of stars between the clouds. "How long have you had this?" she said. The summary: 8 months. "The underlying investigation began 3 years ago, when my father's old steward mentioned the name Rowan while going through old correspondence. It took considerable time to establish the connection between Anna and the Valecrest household." 3 years, she said. "Yes." She looked at him. He was watching her with the same quality of attention he had brought to every moment of this evening. Not intense in the way that made her want to look away, but complete. The way you look at something when you are genuinely trying to understand it, rather than confirm what you already believe. "Why did you do it this way?" she said. "Tonight. The announcement. You could have sent a solicitor, a letter. You could have conducted the legal process and informed me at the end of it. Why come yourself, and why—" She stopped. "Why the formal request?" he said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. The carriage moved over a rough section of road, and the lamp swayed and steadied. "2 reasons," he said. "The first is practical. A legal investigation into the Valecrest estate has significantly better standing if the claimant has already been removed from their sphere of influence. As long as you were in that house, they had leverage over your comfort, your safety, your willingness to pursue a claim. Removing you removes the leverage. And the second reason," he looked out the window, then back at her. "The formal request establishes your status unambiguously," he said. "Not as a claimant, not as a ward, as a future member of my household in the most protected legal capacity that exists. It makes you difficult to dismiss, difficult to discredit. Whatever the Valecrests attempt over the next months, they will be attempting it against the future Duchess of Blackthorne, and that is a different contest than the one they would have been comfortable fighting." Eliza sat with this. "That's a very practical reason to propose marriage to someone," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is. Are there impractical ones?" The silence that followed was brief but had texture. "There will be time to answer that question properly," he said, "not in a moving carriage in the dark." She looked at him for a long moment. He held the look without deflection. "I haven't said yes," she said. "No," he said. "You haven't." "I haven't said no either." "I know." The carriage moved through the dark. The heated brick had warmed the floor, and the lamp swayed gently, and she held the document in her hands, with the figure still visible at the bottom, the number that represented 20 years of erasure and the specific cost of what had been taken from her. And she thought, carefully, practically, the way she had always thought when the ground shifted beneath her, about what it meant that the man across from her had spent 3 years and considerable resources finding out the exact dimensions of what this household had stolen from a woman who was already dead. That kind of sustained attention was not obligation. It was not sentimental either, not exactly. She did not yet have a word for what it was. She looked out the window at the dark countryside moving past, and let herself, very cautiously, consider the possibility that the ground might be about to change in a direction she had stopped letting herself imagine. Then the carriage jolted to a stop. Adrian was upright immediately, one hand on the door. His coachman's voice came from above, halt. Sharp, tight. "Your Grace, riders." 3 horses blocked the road ahead. Their torches threw orange light across the carriage front. And as Adrian pushed the door open and stepped out, Eliza leaned to the window and saw, in the torchlight, on the center horse, with her hair loose and her riding coat thrown over her evening dress, and her face arranged into something that had moved well past dignity, into something raw and more dangerous. Vivian Valecrest. She had not stayed in the house to construct something. She had ridden out ahead of them. And in her hand, held up in the torchlight so that there was no possible ambiguity about what it was a letter, sealed with a crest that Eliza did not recognize, but that Adrian, from the way his stillness sharpened into something different, clearly did. "You should know," Vivian said, her voice carrying clean and cold across the night air, "before you continue this, whatever this is, that I sent a message to Lord Harwick 3 hours ago, before dinner. When Father first told me you were coming." She paused. "He has certain letters. Letters Anna Rowan wrote, years ago. Letters that describe in considerable detail a matter that would complicate your investigation significantly, Your Grace." The torchlight moved. Adrian said nothing. "Come back to the house," Vivian said, "and we can discuss this like rational people. Or continue to the Blackthorne estate and discover in the morning that the legal terrain has changed rather substantially overnight. The night held them in it. 3 torches, 2 carriages, the cold road between the Valecrest estate and everything that came after it. And Eliza, watching from the carriage window, understood with absolute precision that this was the moment the situation stopped being recoverable by any ordinary means, whatever Vivian had sent, whatever Harwick held. They had just reached the edge of something that, once crossed, could not be uncrossed. Adrian stood in the road and looked at Vivian Valecrest on her horse and did not say anything for a long time. The torches moved in the wind. One of the hired riders flanking her, 2 men, not household staff, strangers, shifted his weight, and his horse stepped sideways, and he corrected it with the economy of someone paid to look capable. The road was empty in both directions. The Valecrest estate was a mile behind them, its lights still visible as a warm smear against the dark. Adrian looked at the letter in Vivian's hand. "Harwick," he said. "You know the name," Vivian said. "Good. That saves time. How long have you been holding that arrangement?" "I haven't been holding anything." She adjusted her grip on the reins. Her horse was restless. She had ridden hard to get ahead of the carriage, and the animal hadn't settled. "I made a contingency. The way sensible people do when they understand that powerful men sometimes decide to be unpredictable." "You planned for this evening specifically." "I planned for the possibility of something like this evening." She looked at him with the flat clarity of someone who had moved past the humiliation of the drawing room into a different register entirely, colder, more functional, the part of Vivian Valecrest that had never been about the beauty or the performance, but had always been about the arithmetic underneath. "My father doesn't plan past the next dinner party. My mother plans for appearances. I plan for outcomes." In the carriage behind him, Eliza was at the window. He didn't turn to look. He knew she was there the same way he knew where every person in a room was, not by looking, but by a kind of continuous spatial awareness that had been useful enough over the years that it had become automatic. "Tell me what Harwick has," he said. "Letters," Vivian said. "I told you." "Letters saying what?" She paused. The torch nearest her threw its light across the side of her face, and he could see the working of it, the calculation about how much to disclose, the assessment of how much disclosure served her position. She was good at this. He had underestimated how good she was at this, which was a failure he was noting and filing. "Letters your mother wrote to Anna Rowan," she said, "in the year before Anna came to your estate." The road was very quiet. "My mother died in 1841, Adrian said. "Yes." Vivian held his gaze. 2 years before Anna came to Blackthorne, but the letters predate that, and they discuss certain matters relating to your father's debt, specifically the origin of it. She paused. Specifically, the fact that the origin was not what you've been told. The wind moved through the trees along the road margin, and the torches guttered and recovered. Adrian's face did not change. This was the thing about him. The surface held regardless of what was happening underneath it, and what was happening underneath it right now was significant. Not because Vivian's disclosure frightened him in a simple way, but because it opened a door he had not known existed, and behind that door was the possibility that the architecture of the last 3 years, the investigation, the reasoning, the clean moral logic of a debt owed and a daughter found, was built on a foundation that contained a flaw he had not examined. He did not let any of this reach his face. "Come back to the house," Vivian said. Her voice had dropped slightly, shifted from cold to something that was almost reasonable. Let Eliza go back to her room. And in the morning, when we've all had time to think clearly, we can discuss what an arrangement might look like that serves everyone's interests. Everyone's interests, he said. Yours, mine. The legal situation resolves itself quietly. No investigation, no public proceeding, no letters that become inconvenient. She looked at him. She goes back to the life she knows. You go back to Blackthorne without a complication. Everyone is served. The silence that followed was the kind that has edges. Then Adrian turned and walked back to the carriage. Vivian said, "Your Grace." He opened the carriage door. Eliza was watching him with the expression she'd had since the window, alert, reading him, running her own calculations. She had heard enough of the exchange to know the shape of it. He could see that in her face. "We're going to Blackthorne," he said. "She'll send those letters," Eliza said. "Yes." "Whatever they say." "I'll deal with what they say when I know what they say," he said. "Get back from the window." She moved. He closed the carriage door, turned to the coachman, and said 2 words. The horses moved. Vivian did not try to physically stop them. She sat on her horse in the road and watched the carriage pass, and the torchlight fell across her face as it went by. And Eliza, from the interior dark of the carriage, looked through the glass at that face and thought, not for the first time in 7 years of living alongside its owner, that the most dangerous version of Vivian Valecrest was not the one performing in a drawing room, but the one sitting still in a dark road, watching, already 3 moves ahead. Blackthorne Manor arrived out of the dark like a fact. No performance to it, no torchlight arrangement, no footmen staged at the doors. It was simply there, massive and certain, the kind of structure that had been standing long enough to have stopped needing to announce itself. Stone, not brick. The proportions serious. The grounds visible even at night as a disciplined darkness, shaped rather than wild. The housekeeper met them at the door, a woman of 60 named Mrs. Crane, who had apparently been informed of the possibility of a guest because she received Eliza without visible surprise and led her to a room in the east wing that was warm, fire already laid, with a nightgown and washing things already set out. The room was the size of the entire servants' floor at Valecrest. Eliza stood in the center of it and did not move for a moment. Mrs. Crane said, "Is there anything you need tonight, miss?" "No," Eliza said. Then, because she was not used to being asked, "Thank you." The housekeeper nodded and left, and the door closed, and Eliza was alone for the first time since the corridor at Valecrest, and she let herself have the full weight of it. Not 40 seconds this time, but the real duration of it, standing in the center of a warm room in a house that was not trying to erase her, and feeling how strange that was, how structurally unfamiliar, like using muscles that had atrophied from years of deliberate disuse. She sat on the edge of the bed. In the morning, things would be complicated and possibly dangerous and full of variables she couldn't yet read. Vivian would move. Harwick, whoever he was, would produce whatever he had. The legal situation that had seemed clear in the carriage would develop new complexity. She knew all of this. She sat on the edge of the bed and took off her boots and felt the warmth of the fire and thought, not yet safe, but not in immediate danger, which was a distinction that mattered enormously when you had spent long enough in conditions where immediate danger was the baseline. She lay down in her coat and was asleep within 4 minutes. Adrian was not asleep. He was in his study with the lamp turned high and 3 different ledgers open on the desk and a letter half-drafted in front of him addressed to his legal counsel in the capital, and he had been there since the carriage reached the estate 2 hours ago. His secretary, Aldrich Penn, had been summoned at midnight and was now sitting across the desk with the particular alert stillness of a man who had worked for Adrian for 11 years and had been woken in the middle of the night by him enough times to know that the quality of the summons mattered. This summons had had a quality Aldrich had not encountered before. "Harwick," Adrian said. "I know the name," Aldrich said carefully. "Tell me what you know." Aldrich looked at the surface of the desk. He was 43, thin, with the kind of face that collected information without appearing to, a face that people looked at and assessed as unimportant, which had made him enormously useful over the years. He had come to Blackthorne from a legal practice in the city, and he understood things about the movement of documents and money and influence that most men in his position chose not to understand because understanding them created obligations. Harwick is a collector, Aldrich said, not in the usual sense. He collects leverage, documentation, things people would prefer not to be made public. He holds them, not to use them immediately, but to have them available. He's provided services to several families in this county over the past decade. Services. Insurance. For a fee. Adrian was quiet. And the Valecrests have been clients. I believe so, yes. For how long? Aldrich paused. This was a different kind of pause than the ones Adrian usually watched for. Not the pause of concealment, but the pause of a man deciding how much of something he already knew to disclose. Adrian had seen that pause in Aldrich before, and each time it occurred it sharpened something in him, a very cold and very specific form of attention that he kept in reserve for situations requiring it. Aldrich. Possibly since before your father's debt crisis, Aldrich said. There is, I have heard, through channels, that there are documents held by Harwick that predate Anna Rowan's involvement with Blackthorne, that relate to the origin of the debt itself. The lamp threw its light across the desk. Adrian looked at the half-drafted letter. Then he looked at Aldrich. You knew this, he said. Not a question, not yet an accusation, a statement in the process of becoming one. I had heard. How long? Aldrich's jaw tightened. 8 months. 8 months. The same period Adrian had held the legal summary he had shown Eliza in the carriage, the summary Aldrich had helped compile. The room was very still. You compiled the investigation summary, Adrian said. Yes. You knew what Harwick held might contradict the basis of that summary. I knew it might complicate. Did it contradict it? Specifically, do you know? A long pause, the longest yet. I believe, Aldrich said very carefully, that the letters Harwick holds may indicate that your father's debt to the Valecrest estate was not a simple debt, that there were transactions between your father and Lord Valecrest's father that involved Anna Rowan's family property, directly, not as collateral, but as the source. He stopped. I believe the debt your father owed may have been created in part through the same misappropriation you've been preparing to prosecute Valecrest for. The silence that came then was different from all the preceding silences. Adrian sat completely still. The lamp burned. Outside, somewhere in the grounds, a nightbird called once and stopped. He thought about his father, the man who had received Anna Rowan's help and spent years trying to find her daughter to repay the obligation. The clean moral story of it, the debt, the gratitude, the search. He had held that story for 3 years. He had built the entire architecture of this evening on it, the justification for every action taken, the foundation on which he had stood in a corridor in the Valecrest estate and made a promise to a woman with bruises on her wrists. And now Aldrich was telling him, had known, and not told him for 8 months, that the foundation might be rotten at one corner, that the man he had believed owed a clean debt might have been a participant in a transaction that was not clean at all. He stood up. Aldrich stood too, reflexively. Your Grace, why? Adrian said. His voice was the same. Still the same temperature. He had trained it to that temperature over so many years that it held now even through this. Specifically, why did you not tell me? Aldrich's face moved through something that was not quite shame but was adjacent to it, the expression of a man who had made a calculation and was now being required to account for it. Because the investigation was sound regardless, Aldrich said. The Valecrest misappropriation was real. The harm to Eliza Rowan was real. The complication of your father's involvement, it doesn't undo the underlying wrong. It complicates the standing, the framing, but the essential case, you decided, Adrian said, what I needed to know. I made a judgment. You made my judgment for me. The temperature in his voice dropped a precise degree. You held information that was directly relevant to my decision-making, and you withheld it because you assessed that I would still arrive at the same destination regardless. And in doing that, you took from me the ability to make an informed choice about the ground I was standing on. Aldrich said nothing. You've worked for me for 11 years, Adrian said. Yes. 11 years in which the one thing I have required above everything else is that I know what I'm walking into. Yes. Aldrich's voice was quiet. I know. And you chose? I chose to protect you from information that I believed would deter you from doing something necessary, Aldrich said. Quiet, but direct. He was not collapsing under it, which was the only thing that stopped Adrian from losing the last of his control over the temperature. I was wrong to make that choice. I know that. I made it anyway. The lamp burned. The nightbird did not call again. Adrian turned away from the desk and stood at the window with his hands at his sides, looking out at the dark grounds of Blackthorne. And he felt, in the specific cavity of his chest where certainty usually lived, the particular sensation of a structure that has been load-bearing for a long time beginning to examine its own foundations. He had come to Valecrest tonight with the full confidence of a man who knew exactly where he stood. He had known what had been taken, and from whom, and by whose hand, and the knowing had been clean, and the action taken on the basis of that knowing had been clean, and the woman he had brought out of that house was the legitimate recipient of a debt that had been owed to her family for 20 years. All of that was still true. And also, his father's ledger was not clean. And also, Aldrich Penn, who had been at his right hand for 11 years, had known and said nothing. And also, Vivian Valecrest was already in motion with whatever Harwick held, and by morning the shape of the legal terrain would be different than it had been at sunset. He turned back. You'll draft me a full account of everything you know about Harwick and about my father's transactions with the Valecrest estate, he said. Everything, by 5 in the morning. Yes, Your Grace. And then you'll have your things gathered by 7. Aldrich went very still. I'm not dismissing you, Adrian said. I'm sending you to the city. You're going to Harwick directly. Not my legal team. You. Because you understand what he holds and you know the terrain, and because whatever arrangement he has with the Valecrest, I want it examined and dissolved before the end of this week. He paused. You can do that. You know you can do that. Aldrich released a breath. Yes. Whether you and I have a different conversation after that depends on what else you're holding that you haven't told me, Adrian said. I'd encourage you to begin the full account with that question in mind. Aldrich nodded once. He went to the door, stopped. The girl, he said. Eliza. Whatever the complications, she didn't do anything wrong. I know, Adrian said. That was never in question. Aldrich left. Adrian stood alone in the study with the 3 open ledgers and the half-drafted letter and the lamp burning toward its lower third, and for the first time in this very long night he allowed himself the internal version of what his face had not shown, the full weight of it, the ground having shifted, the clean story having acquired its complication, the man he had trusted for 11 years having made a private decision about what Adrian needed to know. It was not the Valecrest that had done this. Vivian's riders in the road had been the delivery mechanism, but the real damage had been sitting across his desk for 8 months, drafting legal summaries, present at every strategy session, trusted with the full architecture of a plan that he had built, at least in part, on incomplete information. You never saw it coming from the closest ones. Not because the closest ones were more treacherous by nature, but because proximity meant you stopped measuring them. Stopped applying the same scrutiny to the people inside your circle that you applied to everything outside it. He had known this in an abstract sense for most of his adult life. He had just spent 11 years failing to actually practice it. He sat back down, pulled the half-drafted letter toward him, and began, in his precise and unchanged handwriting, to reconstruct the architecture of the next 72 hours, not from the ground he had believed he was standing on, but from the actual ground with all its complications visible, with nothing excluded because someone had decided he didn't need to see it. He would go into whatever came next without the clean story, just the facts as they actually were, just the obligation that was real regardless of its complicated origins. Just Eliza Rowan, asleep in the East Wing, who had walked out of that house in her gray coat with the replaced button, and who had not yet said yes but had not said no either, and who deserved, whatever it cost, whatever the ground turned out to actually be made of, to find out what her life looked like when it was finally her own. He rode until the lamp ran low, and somewhere in the main house, a door he had not heard open closed very quietly, and the sound of it reached him a half-second too late. By the time he was on his feet and in the corridor, the east wing passage was empty. Eliza's room was open. She was gone. The east wing passage was cold and empty, and the door to Eliza's room stood open at an angle that suggested haste, not thrown open, not left carelessly, but pushed wide by someone moving fast and not pausing to manage the details behind them. Adrian stood in the doorway for 3 seconds. The fire was still burning, the nightgown on the bed untouched. Her gray coat was gone. The boots she had removed. He could see the impression of where she had set them beside the bed, the slight compression in the rug, were gone too. She had dressed in the dark, quietly, and she had left, and the fact that the door was open rather than closed told him she had not been trying to conceal the departure. She had simply left. He went back to the study and pulled the bell cord once. The night footman appeared in 90 seconds. Young, startled, doing the rapid recalibration of someone pulled from half-sleep into the presence of an employer who was already moving. "The guest in the east wing," Adrian said. "When did she pass through the main hall?" Your Grace, I didn't see the servant's entrance." The footman's face shifted. "Perhaps 20 minutes ago, sir. I heard the latch, but I assumed—" "Saddle the gray," Adrian said. "Now, bad." He found her on the road. Not the Valecrest road, the eastern road, which ran toward the village, and beyond the village toward the county line, and beyond that toward anywhere a person could reach on foot in a night, if they were determined enough and frightened enough, and had spent enough years learning to move without being noticed. She was a dark shape against the road's pale surface, walking fast, coat buttoned to the throat, and she did not turn when she heard the horse because she had already heard it and had calculated in the seconds before he reached her that running was not useful and had chosen instead to stop and turn and face what was coming. He pulled up beside her and dismounted in one motion. She looked at him. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. Her face was the controlled face, the one she had put on the night he first saw her in the Valecrest dining room, the wide, watchful stillness that kept everything underneath it inaccessible. "Get on the horse," he said. "No. It's 4 degrees and you're 2 miles from the nearest shelter that isn't Blackthorne." "I know how cold it is," she said. "I've been cold before." He looked at her for a moment. The horse shifted behind him and he steadied it without looking away from her face. "What did you hear?" he said. She said nothing. "Eliza, what did you hear?" The controlled face held for 2 more seconds, and then something moved in it. Not collapse, not tears, nothing that simple. Just a specific tightening around the eyes that happened when a person was holding something that had become very heavy. "Enough," she said. "I heard enough." She had been awake. She had heard Aldrich in the corridor, or heard the voices through the study door, or heard enough of the shape of the conversation to reconstruct what she needed to reconstruct. He didn't know precisely how much. He knew from the fact that she was on this road in the dark that it had been sufficient. "The debt your father owed," she said. "It wasn't clean." "No. He was involved with Valecrest's father, in the same—" She stopped. "In the same kind of arrangement." "Possibly. I don't have the full picture yet. Aldrich is getting it." "But possibly." Her voice was flat. Not angry. The flatness of someone who has received a piece of information and is in the process of integrating it into a worldview that already had a slot waiting for exactly this kind of thing. "The man you've been building this case on. The origin of your obligation to my mother. It might have been— It doesn't change what was done to you," he said. "It changes what I am to you," she said. "It changes the whole structure of it. If your father was a participant and not just a beneficiary, if the debt you think you owe is actually something else, something more complicated." She looked at him directly. "Then I'm not the person you came to Valecrest to find. I'm the person who makes the story cleaner, and I don't want to be someone's story." The road was very still. The cold pressed in from all directions. He could see her clearly in the dark, eyes that had not flinched from him, jaw that was set not with stubbornness but with the specific resolution of someone who had made a decision that cost them something and was not going to have it talked out from under them. He had been afraid of a lot of things in his life. Not often, and not in ways that other people could see, but fear was a real variable in his interior accounting, and he had learned to work with it rather than against it. What he felt standing in this road was something adjacent to fear. Not of losing, not of the legal complication, not of Vivian's letters or Harwick's leverage. The thing adjacent to fear was the specific sensation of watching someone you have no right to hold walk away from you on a road in the dark, and knowing that the honest version of yourself has no argument against it. "You're right," he said. She blinked. That she had not anticipated. "The structure is complicated, and I should have told you that before I said anything in that corridor," he said. "I had incomplete information, and I built a case on it, and I brought you out of that house on the basis of that case, and if the case is different than I presented it, then the choice you made was not fully informed." He paused. "That's true. I'm not going to argue it." She was looking at him with the expression of someone recalibrating. "But I want you to hear what is not complicated," he said. "What they did to you, the property, the inheritance, the 7 years, that is documented and real and does not change regardless of what my father was or wasn't part of. What I saw in that house tonight, the bruise, the practiced lie about a doorframe, the way you adjusted your sleeve without thinking, that is real, and it was wrong, and it has been wrong every day for 7 years. He looked at her. "And the woman in that portrait is your mother, and she helped my family when they needed it, and I don't care what transactions surrounded that fact. The fact itself stands." The cold moved between them. "I'm also going to tell you that I am going to fix this," he said. "Not because you're a story I'm trying to clean up, because it's fixable, and it's owed and I have the means to do it. Those are 3 separate reasons, and none of them require you to feel anything about me in particular." Eliza looked at the road ahead, then at him, then at the horse. "I still haven't said yes," she said. "I know." "I want to see the full account," she said. "Everything Aldrich writes tonight. I want to read the letters Harwick holds, if they can be obtained. I want to understand the actual ground before I stand on it." "That's exactly right," he said. "That's exactly what you should want." She walked to the horse and put her foot in the stirrup and swung up with the efficiency of someone who had grown up in a county house before they were reduced to serving in one. She looked down at him. "You're not what I expected," she said. It was not a compliment, not quite. It was simply an observation, delivered with the precision of someone who said things because they were true and not because they were welcome. "Neither are you," he said. He took the reins and led the horse back toward Blackthorne, and she rode above him in silence, and the dark road held them both, and neither of them said anything else until the manor's lights came back into view. Aldrich's full account arrived at 5:17 in the morning. 14 pages, dense, written in the compressed shorthand of a man who had spent the night excavating his own knowledge and his own failures simultaneously. Adrian read it at the desk in the study with Eliza sitting across from him. She had come down an hour before dawn, coat still on, and had simply appeared in the doorway with the expression of someone who had decided to stop waiting and start knowing. He passed her pages as he finished them. She read fast. Didn't ask questions while she read. When she finished a page, she set it face down on the desk beside her and moved to the next one, and her face during this process was the most unguarded he had seen it, not because her control was slipping, but because she had made a conscious decision to stop deploying it, at least here, at least in this room, at least for now. The full account confirmed the complication. Adrian's grandfather had been involved in the original land transactions that had, over 2 generations and through several degrees of separation, produced the circumstances of both his father's debt and the Rowan family's vulnerability. It was not a simple clean villainy. The original transaction had been legal, if predatory, and the accumulated effect of it had been exploited by Lord Valecrest's father and then compounded by Cresswell Valecrest himself, who had seen a specific opportunity in Anna Rowan's death and had taken it. Adrian's father had not known. The account was clear on this. The transactions had been buried deep enough that a man of good faith managing a debt crisis would not have seen the underlying structure. He had accepted Anna's help as the clean thing it appeared to be. The comfort of that did not fully resolve the larger complication. It didn't need to. Eliza set the last page down. "Harwick has copies of the original land documents," she said. "Yes. If those become public, They complicate the legal framing, he said, not the outcome. The Valecrest misappropriation is documented independently of my family's involvement in the prior generation. The two cases are related historically, but separable legally. Vivian knows this, Eliza said. He looked at her. She's not stupid, Eliza said. She knows the letters don't destroy your case. She knows they complicate it. She's using them because complication is enough. It creates delay. It creates doubt. It creates the kind of public ambiguity that makes people look at the situation and decide it's too messy to have an opinion about. She paused. She's been watching this household use ambiguity as a tool her entire life. She learned from the best. He considered this. What would you do? She looked at him steadily. Take it public before she does. The complication. All of it. Your grandfather's involvement, your father's debt, the full history. Present it yourself in your own terms before Harwick and Vivian can present it in theirs. She leaned forward slightly. A man who discloses his own family's failures to correct a larger wrong is harder to discredit than a man defending himself against accusations. The narrative changes completely. He looked at her for a long moment. You've been thinking about how power works, he said, for a long time. You learn a lot about how power works, she said, when you're on the wrong side of it for 7 years. Check. They were still at the desk when the rider arrived at 7:40 in the morning. Not Harwick's man, not the Valecrests. A royal courier, which was a different category of arrival entirely. The crest on the leather satchel was the kind that made Mrs. Crane bring it directly to the study rather than the front receiving room, and the expression on her face when she set it on the desk told Adrian that she had recognized the crest and understood what category of complication it represented. He opened it, read it once, then again. Eliza watched his face do the thing it almost never did, move. Not dramatically, not in the way faces moved in stories. A small, precise change around the jaw and eyes that lasted perhaps 4 seconds before the surface reasserted itself. What is it? She said. He set the letter on the desk and turned it toward her. She read. It was a summons. Not legal, not criminal. A royal summons to a ball, 3 days hence, at the palace, the masquerade. Annual, mandatory for families of the first rank, the kind of event that no one of significance could absent themselves from without it being read as a statement. The kind of event where everything that had happened in the last 12 hours would be present in the same room simultaneously. Every family that had heard the rumors by now, every social connection the Valecrests had spent decades cultivating, every person who would be watching Adrian Blackthorne walk in with a woman nobody recognized and drawing their own conclusions before either of them spoke a word. At the bottom of the letter, in a different hand, smaller, less formal, the addition of someone who had access to a royal courier and had used that access to attach a personal note, were 11 words. She read them 3 times. Then she looked up. Vivian will be there, she said. Yes. She's going to use it. Not a question. 3 days. She'll have had time to circulate the letters, prime the room. She'll wait until the maximum number of people are present, and then, yes, he said. Eliza set the letter down. She looked at the 14 pages of Aldrich's account spread across the desk. She looked at the portrait, which Adrian had set on the corner of the desk sometime in the night. Her mother's face in its tarnished oval frame, watching the room with the calm of someone who had already made their hardest choices and could afford equanimity. She looked at her own hands, flat on the desk surface. The sleeve had pushed back slightly, and the yellow bruise was visible in the morning light, the old one, fading, but not yet gone. She pushed the sleeve back down. Then she looked at Adrian. I'll need a dress, she said. I don't own anything appropriate for a royal masquerade. Something moved in Adrian's face. Brief. The closest thing to warmth she had seen from him. That can be arranged, he said. And I'll need to know everything, she said. Everything you know about everyone who will be in that room. Every connection the Valecrests have, every person Vivian has been cultivating, every potential ally and every likely opponent. I want to go into that room the way you go into rooms, knowing the ground before I stand on it. Yes, he said, and when Vivian makes her move, she paused. Let me answer it. He looked at her steadily, reading her the way she had been reading him, not for performance, not for the surface, but for the actual thing underneath. "You're sure," he said. "I've been invisible in that world for 7 years," she said. "I know exactly where everybody is buried. I know exactly what every one of those families has done and pretended not to do and paid to have forgotten." She held his gaze. "Vivian has been performing in that room her entire life. I've been watching it from the service entrance." She paused. "Let her come." 3 days, the masquerade. And somewhere in the city, at a townhouse that operated on leverage and silence, Harwick was already moving, sealing envelopes, dispatching messengers, setting in motion the mechanism that Vivian had engaged 3 days ago when she had understood, with the strategic clarity that had always been her most dangerous quality, that the evening was going wrong. And in the Valecrest estate, in the cold morning light, Lord Cresswell Valecrest was sitting at his own desk with his wife standing behind him and his daughter's riding coat still damp from the night before draped over the chair across from him, looking at the inventory of what the next 72 hours required him to protect, and understanding for the first time with full clarity that he was not defending a position anymore. He was executing a retreat. The only question was whether he could move fast enough. And in the east wing of Blackthorne Manor, the portrait of Anna Rowan sat in its tarnished frame on the corner of a desk covered in 14 pages of documented history, and the morning light came through the study window and fell across it, and the woman in it looked out at the room with her wide-set eyes and her particular jaw, and whatever she had carried in her when she walked into this family's house 30 years ago and refused payment for saving it, that thing, whatever it was present in the room, in the woman sitting across the desk. In the set of her shoulders and the flatness of her voice and the 7 years of watchfulness that had built in her something that was not yet fully visible but was becoming visible. The way things become visible when the conditions that have been suppressing them are finally, after a very long time, removed. 3 days. The palace. The masks. And Vivian Valecrest, already composing the words she intended to say in the most crowded room in the kingdom. Already certain, with the certainty of a woman who had never once in her life been publicly defeated, that she knew exactly how this ended. She did not know. She did not know yet what walked toward her. The palace ballroom held 400 candles and twice that many opinions. That was the first thing Eliza understood when she walked through the entrance arch on Adrian's arm. Not the gold leaf on the ceiling vaulting, not the mirrors that doubled and redoubled the candlelight until the room seemed to exist inside its own illumination, not the orchestra positioned in the gallery above. What she understood first was the quality of attention in the room, the way 400 masked faces turned by increments toward the entrance, and the turning had a specific texture, a specific weight, the weight of a room that had already been briefed. They knew who she was, not her name, not yet. But they knew there was a woman on the Duke of Blackthorne's arm who was not Vivian Valecrest. And they knew, because 3 days was sufficient time for the shape of a scandal to circulate through every drawing room and private correspondence in the capital, that this woman was the reason the Valecrest family had arrived tonight with the particular quality of stillness that belonged to households in the early stages of legal difficulty. Eliza had known this was how it would feel. She had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything that mattered, by sitting with the reality of it in advance, by holding the discomfort of it until it became familiar, by refusing to let the anticipation be worse than the thing itself. 3 days at Blackthorne had given her time she had never previously had in her life, the time to think without the pressure of immediate threat, and what she had done with that time was work. She had read everything Aldrich sent from the city. She had memorized the map of every significant connection in this room. She had learned the dress, deep green silk that Mrs. Crane had arranged with a speed that suggested Adrian had given instructions before Eliza ever walked down to the study that first morning. And she had learned how to stand in it, which was different from how she had stood in wool and gray for 7 years. She did not feel like a different person. She felt like the same person with the suppressors finally removed. Adrian walked beside her without performing anything. He did not display her. He did not guide her with the proprietary pressure that men in his position used on women they were presenting to rooms. He simply walked beside her at the same pace, which communicated something the room was reading even if they couldn't name it, that she was not an ornament and not a project and not a statement he was making at someone else's expense. She was simply there, and he was simply there. And the simplicity of it in a room built entirely on performance was its own kind of disruption. She found Vivian in 40 seconds. East side of the ballroom, near the second pillar, in ivory silk and a white half-mask that she wore with the authority of someone who understood that masks at a masquerade were not concealment, but emphasis. She was standing with two other women and a man Eliza recognized from Aldrich's account as Lord Pemberton, who held significant social credit in this room and whose opinion moved other opinions. Vivian had chosen her position carefully. She had the sight lines, the proximity to the room's center of gravity, and she had been here long enough to have already done preliminary work. She had not yet seen Eliza. Or she had seen Eliza and had chosen not to register it yet, which was a different kind of preparation. Lord Harwick was near the far wall, which surprised Eliza. She had not expected him to be present personally, had expected his leverage to operate at a distance through documents and intermediaries. His presence here meant the evening had escalated beyond what she and Adrian had planned for. A man who came in person to watch the outcome of his leverage was a man who believed the outcome was settled. Adrian felt her attention change, not through anything she said, through the slight adjustment of her arm against his. He said, very quietly, "Harwick is here." "I see him." Aldrich's man was not able to recover the originals, he said. Equally quiet. The information delivered without apology, without softening. The way he gave her everything, as fact, as ground to stand on, as the actual condition rather than the comfortable version of it. He has copies of the key documents, but Harwick retained the originals. She absorbed this. Then we proceed without the recovery. Yes. Does that change what I plan to say? He was quiet for a moment. Around them the room moved and murmured, and the orchestra played something formal, and the candles burned at their 400 separate intensities. No, he said. What you plan to say is still true regardless of what documents he holds. The truth doesn't require the originals. She nodded once, small, more to herself than to him. They moved into the room. It took Vivian 40 minutes to make her move, which was longer than Eliza had anticipated. She used the time. She let Adrian introduce her to three people whose opinions anchored sections of the room, and she watched how they received her, the calibration of their courtesy, the specific quality of their interest, whether they were treating her as a curiosity or as a person. Two of the three landed in a middle position that she assessed as movable. The third, a woman of 70 named Lady Ashford, who had outlasted 4 monarchs and whose social authority in this room was geological in its permanence, looked at Eliza for a long moment over her mask and then said, "You have your mother's jaw, child," and turned away to speak to someone else before Eliza could respond to the fact that she had just confirmed, casually and entirely without drama, that she already knew exactly who Eliza was. Adrian heard it. His expression did not change, but his hand, very briefly, pressed slightly against her arm. When Vivian moved, she moved well. She crossed the floor during a pause between musical sets, when the room's ambient noise had dropped, and more people were standing still in conversation rather than moving, which meant more people would be present for what happened. She brought Pemberton with her, which was the right choice. His presence elevated the social weight of whatever she was about to do. She was carrying something, not visibly, but in the quality of her movement, the specific way she held herself when she was about to deliver something she had been preparing. She stopped 8 feet from Eliza and Adrian. The conversations around them did not stop, but they became slightly more shallow, occupying less processing capacity because the people conducting them were now also tracking this. "Your Grace," Vivian said to Adrian with a courtesy that was technically perfect and completely empty. Then her eyes moved to Eliza. She did not use a title. "I hope the past 3 days have been comfortable." Eliza looked at her. This was the moment she had prepared for, and it was also the moment that no preparation fully accounted for. Standing in front of a woman who had been a fixture of her interior landscape for 7 years, who had organized her daily existence in ways both direct and ambient, and meeting her eyes across a ballroom floor as an equal rather than a subordinate. The feeling of it was strange, not triumphant, not as simple as that. More like standing in a room you have cleaned 100 times and seeing it for the first time from the perspective of someone who belongs in it. Very comfortable, Eliza said. Thank you. Vivian's mouth curved. I'm glad, though I imagine it will become somewhat less comfortable once. She paused for the specific duration required to draw additional attention without appearing to demand it. Once certain correspondence that's been circulating among the relevant families is more broadly discussed. The letters, Eliza said. Vivian blinked. She had not expected the direct acknowledgement. Yes, she said, recovering. The letters your mother wrote, which raise rather significant questions about the foundation of Duke Blackthorne's legal claims. Questions about his own family's involvement in the original. Yes, Eliza said again. We published those this morning. The room, or the 12 people within direct earshot, which was sufficient, went very still. Vivian's face did something it had never done in Eliza's presence. It lost its arrangement. Not for long, 2 seconds, perhaps 3, but long enough. I beg your pardon, she said. The full account, Eliza said. Duke Blackthorne's grandfather's involvement in the original land transactions, his father's debt and the circumstances surrounding it, Anna Rowan's assistance to the Blackthorne estate and the context around it. All of it. Published this morning in a voluntary disclosure to the relevant legal authorities and circulated to the major social correspondents. She held Vivian's gaze without effort. There's nothing in those letters that isn't already a matter of record. The silence had expanded. The people within earshot had stopped maintaining the fiction of their side conversations. Pemberton, beside Vivian, was looking at the floor with the expression of a man revising his assessment of where the solid ground was. Vivian began. You spent 3 days preparing to destroy something, Eliza said. Her voice was quiet, not aggressive. Not the performed calm of someone suppressing anger, but the actual calm of someone who had moved through the anger and come out the other side. I spent 3 days removing the thing you were trying to destroy. There's nothing left to leverage. Vivian looked at Adrian. Adrian looked back at her and said nothing, which was its own complete statement. Something happened in Vivian's face. It was not the collapse Eliza had, in certain honest moments over the past 3 days, imagined. It was more complicated than collapse. The expression of a woman who had been performing a particular version of herself for so long that the performance and the self had become structurally indistinguishable, and who was now standing in a room full of witnesses at the moment those two things were being asked to separate. You don't belong here, Vivian said. Quiet. The performance entirely gone, just the raw interior of it, and Eliza said more gently than she had intended, Neither did you really. You just had more practice pretending. Harwick left the ball within 20 minutes. Lord Pemberton spent the remainder of the evening finding reasons to speak with Adrian, which was its own form of social weather report. Lady Ashford, at the end of the night, caught Eliza's arm as she was moving toward the entrance and said without preamble, Your mother would have handled that differently. A pause. More quietly, but the same outcome. She patted Eliza's arm once and moved away. The Valecrest family did not remain for the supper. Chisans. The weeks that followed had the quality of water receding after a flood. Slow, revealing, leaving behind a landscape that looked nothing like what it had before, but was in most ways more honest. The legal proceedings began. The investigation into the Valecrest estate produced what Aldrich had promised it would produce, documentation sufficient, in the assessment of 3 independent legal authorities, to establish the misappropriation clearly and the remedies available. Lord Cresswell Valecrest retained counsel. The counsel was good, the documentation was better. Eliza read every filing. Adrian showed her everything. This was the thing she had not been prepared for. Not the legal outcomes, not the formal restoration of her mother's estate and what remained of its assets, not even the moment a court officer addressed her by her full name for the first time, and the name had weight, had history, had the substance of something real and permanent. What she had not been prepared for was the experience of being kept fully informed by someone who had the power to manage things for her, and chose instead to let her manage them herself. She thought about that a great deal, In the evenings at Blackthorne, when the correspondence had been answered and the fire was burning low, and Adrian was at the desk across the room finishing whatever he was finishing. She thought about what it meant to be trusted with the full picture. She had spent 7 years in a household where information was controlled the way all resources were controlled, distributed sparingly, strategically, always in service of someone else's position. The experience of receiving information freely, without agenda, without the sensation of something being withheld, was so structurally unfamiliar that she kept testing it, kept looking for the corner of it that would eventually turn out to serve a purpose she hadn't anticipated. She never found the corner. There were difficult days. The legal process had its brutal passages, depositions that required her to give specific detailed accounts of specific incidents, the bruise and its origins among them. Those sessions left her with a particular quality of exhaustion that wasn't physical but lived in the body anyway, a heaviness in the chest and hands that took hours to resolve. She handled them, not without cost, but cleanly, with the same direct attention she had brought to everything since the night she decided to stop moving away from things and start moving through them. She said yes in the 3rd week. Not dramatically, they were in the study. The same desk, the same lamp. And she looked up from the document she was reading and said it the way she said most things, without preamble, without performance, as a fact she had arrived at through careful examination of the available evidence. Yes, she said, to the earlier question. Adrian looked up from his own work. She held his gaze. I've had time to look at the actual ground, she said. It's more complicated than you presented it originally. I've decided I can work with complicated. He was quiet for a moment, then, that's the most practical acceptance of a marriage proposal I've ever heard. Did you want something else? No, he said. He held her gaze and something in his face did what it rarely did. Opened. Not widely, not with the ease of a man who had been opening himself to people his whole life, but with the specific deliberateness of a man who had kept something in reserve for a long time and was choosing, consciously, to move it. No, that was exactly right. Spring came to Blackthorne the way spring came to old estates, gradually and then all at once, the grounds shifting from frozen restraint to something that bordered on extravagance, the trees along the eastern path budding in stages, and the kitchen garden showing its first organized green. Eliza walked the grounds in the mornings. This was a habit she had built in the first weeks at Blackthorne, and had kept, not as routine but as necessity. The same way certain people need to move through physical space in order to move through internal space, the walk and the thinking feeding each other until one was impossible without the other. She thought about her mother on these walks, not with the quality of grief she would have expected. Or not only that, Anna Rowan had made choices that Eliza was only now, in possession of the full account, beginning to understand the cost of. A woman who had helped the family whose ancestor had contributed to her own family's vulnerability. A woman who had refused payment for that help because the debt, in her accounting, ran a different direction than anyone else could see. There was a kind of stubbornness in that, a kind of pride that was not the performative pride of Vivian's ballroom precision, but something older and more private. The pride of a person who has decided what they value and holds to it, regardless of whether the world makes that easy. Eliza understood that kind of pride now in a way she hadn't before. She had spent years believing that what the Valecrests had done to her was the defining condition of her life. Not consciously, not as a philosophy, but structurally, the way a wound shapes the movement around it, without the person always being aware of the accommodation. She had organized herself around the fact of what had been taken. Her caution, her watchfulness, the practiced stillness that Adrian had seen through on the first night, all of it was architecture built around the original damage. The damage was real. She was not revising it or reducing it. What had been done, and it had cost what it had cost, and the legal process that was now running its course was the correct response to it, proportionate and real. But she had walked out of Valecrest in her gray coat with the replaced button, and she had ridden back to Blackthorne on a dark road, and she had sat in a study until dawn reading 14 pages of complicated history. And she had stood in a ballroom and spoken the truth into a room full of people who were expecting her to be silenced by it. And none of those things had been done by a woman defined by damage. They had been done by her mother's daughter. That distinction was taking time to become fully real to her. She let it take the time it needed. She was on the east balcony of Blackthorne Manor on a morning in late April when Adrian came to find her. He came without announcement, which she had learned was how he moved through his own house. Without ceremony, without the performance of his own significance that some men in his position couldn't seem to dispense with even in private. He came and stood beside her at the balcony rail and looked out at the grounds, and they stood in silence for a while, which was a kind of fluency they had developed between them without either of them deciding to, the ability to be in the same space without the silence being a problem to solve. The grounds ran east toward a tree line, and beyond the tree line was open country, and the morning light was doing everything light does in late April in England, which is mostly to make a person understand why people have been writing about English springs for as long as people have been writing about anything. "The Valecrest property is being assessed this week," he said. "I know, I read the notification. There will be a formal determination within the month." She nodded. "Vivienne has left the county," he said. "The family is staying at a smaller property until the proceedings resolve. I thought you should know." She looked at the grounds. Somewhere in her chest, a thing she had been carrying without fully knowing she was carrying it, a specific kind of vigilance, the kind that fires automatically in the direction of known threats, released, not completely, but enough to notice. "I don't want her destroyed," she said. "That's not what this is." He looked at her. "I know it might look like it from the outside," she said. "Legal proceedings, property seizure, public disclosure. It looks like a campaign." She paused. "It's not. It's just repair. The difference matters." "It does," he said. "She's not a good person," Eliza said. "I'm not revising that. But she was also raised in a house that taught her specific things were permissible and other things were not available to her, and she learned those lessons well. That's not absolution. It's just context." She looked at the tree line. "I don't want to spend my life being the person who destroyed the Valecrests. I want to spend my life being something else." Adrian was quiet for a moment. Then, with the deliberateness of someone choosing each word with the same precision he brought to legal documents, "What else?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Someone who built something," she said, "out of the actual material, not the clean version. The actual material, with all its complications and its difficult history and its imperfect foundation." She looked at him. "The way you built Blackthorne." Something passed through his face. The same opening she had seen in the study 3 weeks ago. Conscious, deliberate, not easy. "Blackthorne took 3 generations," he said. "I'm patient," she said. He looked at her for a long time. She had been looked at by this man in many different registers over the past months, assessed, measured, read, and occasionally seen in the way that was different from all of those, the way that went past the surface to whatever was actually present underneath. She had learned not to look away from it. That had been the hardest thing to learn, the thing that went against 7 years of accommodation, holding still when something that felt like genuine attention was directed at her, not deflecting it, not reducing herself to make the attention proportionate to something more comfortable. She held still. "I chose you," he said, "because I recognized something. In that dining room, in the way you arranged those glasses and moved around the edges of a room you had every right to stand in the center of. I recognized the specific quality of a person who has been made to believe they are worth less than they are, and who has decided not to believe it, and who carries that decision in every movement without ever broadcasting it." He paused. "I recognized it because I spent a long time after my father's death learning what it costs to carry things privately, learning that the things you carry alone have a way of shaping you below the level of decision." She said nothing. She let him continue. "I came to Valecrest with a debt and a story," he said. "Both of those were real. But what I found when I got there was more real than either of them, and I didn't handle it perfectly, and the ground turned out to be more complicated than I presented it, and—" He stopped. The precision faltered briefly, the way it sometimes did when he was saying something that had not been composed in advance. "I would have found my way to the same choice regardless of the complications. I want you to know that." The morning light moved across the grounds. She reached out and set her hand on the balcony rail beside his, not on his hand, just beside it, close enough that the warmth was present. A gesture that held in it the same quality as her yes had held: practical, deliberate, arrived at through examination of the actual evidence, and precisely what it was without being more than it was yet or less than it was capable of becoming. He looked at her hand beside his. Then he turned his palm upward. She set her hand in it. They stood on the balcony of Blackthorne Manor and looked out at the grounds going green in the April light, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, and the silence between them was the best kind of silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled, the kind that exists because two people have arrived, through different roads and different costs, at the same place at the same time, and have decided that the place is solid enough to stand on. Not perfect ground, not the clean story, the actual ground, which was, it turned out, the only kind that held.